The job opportunity had come out of nowhere, just like the mansion itself. I had been struggling to make ends meet, and when I saw the ad in the local paper for a live-in cleaning position at a remote mansion, I couldn't believe my luck. The ad had described the mansion as a grand old place with a charming history, and it promised a good wage in exchange for keeping it clean and tidy. It seemed like a dream come true. The mansion was located far from town, nestled deep within a dense forest. The address provided led me to a long, winding road that seemed to stretch on forever. The closer I got, the more isolated and eerie the surroundings became. Tall trees loomed overhead, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to reach out for me. Finally, I arrived at the mansion. It was an imposing structure with ivy-covered walls and large, ornate windows that stared out like vacant eyes. I pulled up to the front entrance, and that's when I saw her, the old woman who owned the mansion. She was standing on the porch, her eyes piercing, and her smile seemed strained. "Welcome," she said, her voice a soft, trembling whisper. "I'm Mrs. Blackwood. You must be the new cleaner." I nodded and introduced myself. She extended a frail hand, which I shook hesitantly. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her pale blue eyes bore into mine as if she was trying to read my soul. "Come inside," she said, leading me through the grand double doors. The interior of the mansion was as impressive as its exterior. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and the floors were adorned with exquisite rugs. The furniture was antique and impeccably maintained. Mrs. Blackwood explained that she had inherited the mansion from her late husband and had been living here alone for many years. "I'm not as young as I used to be," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I need help maintaining the place, but I must stress there's nothing wrong with this house. It's just old, that's all." I believed her, at least at first. The job was straightforward enough. I was to clean and tidy the mansion, and I had my own room in the servants' quarters. The pay was generous, and Mrs. Blackwood promised to leave me to my work, saying she preferred to keep to herself. Days turned into weeks, and the routine settled in. I cleaned the vast rooms, dusting the antique furniture and sweeping the creaking hallways, but there was one door that remained off-limits, a locked door on the third floor. It was old and weathered, with a heavy iron lock that resisted my attempts to pick it. Curiosity gnawed at me every time I passed that door. Mrs. Blackwood had never mentioned it, and it seemed out of place in a house that was otherwise meticulously maintained. One evening, as I stood before the locked door, my resolve crumbled. I had to know what was behind it. I spent hours trying to pick the lock, using tools I had borrowed from the local hardware store. My hands trembled as I worked, but finally the lock gave way with a loud click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led to an underground chamber. As I descended the stairs, a foul odor hit me, like a mixture of decay and rot. The dim light from my flashlight revealed a room filled with cages, each containing something I could barely comprehend. Twisted, contorted figures that seemed like grotesque hybrids of human and animal. They moaned and writhed, their eyes filled with pain and suffering. I stumbled back in horror, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I uncovered? It was then that I heard a voice, a soft, sinister whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You should not have come here," it hissed. I turned to see Mrs. Blackwood standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes now filled with a malevolent glint. She descended slowly, each step echoing like a death knell. "You were warned," she said, her voice cold and unfeeling. "You were told that there was nothing wrong in this house." I backed away, my mind racing for an escape. But the door had slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the nightmarish chamber. Mrs. Blackwood approached, and as she drew closer, I saw the truth in her eyes. She was not a feeble old woman, but something else entirely, something ancient and malefic. The twisted figures in the cages began to claw at their enclosures, their moans growing louder and more desperate. Mrs. Blackwood raised her hand and the cages burst open. The abominations spilled out, their grotesque forms surging toward me. I screamed and turned to run, but it was too late. They were upon me, their hands like gnarled claws, their breath hot and fetid. Darkness closed in, and the last thing I heard was Mrs. Blackwood's chilling laughter echoing through the underground chamber. And so, the mansion's terrible secret remained hidden, as it had for countless years, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon its cursed halls.